we're going to take a few minutes to discuss another aspect of the story of the Pharisees in the New Testament. And this one is maybe the most important. Were the Pharisees the main enemies of Jesus, and were they the ones primarily responsible for handing Jesus over to the Romans for execution? Well, in the previous shorts in this series, we learned from the evidence that they were not all hypocrites, not all legalists, not all people just majoring on minors, nitpicky, and fixated on purely external things. It was from the New Testament that we learned that there were Pharisees who were serious-minded, waiting for the kingdom of God, friends of Jesus who risked their reputations and even their own lives to follow Jesus, both during His earthly life as well as after that. So let's look at the New Testament and see what it has to say about the real enemies of Jesus and who was primarily responsible for handing Him over to the Romans for execution. Does that sound fair enough? Well, when you're watching detective shows, you're always looking for the confluence of a whole bunch of evidence. The nexus, they call it, and you're looking to establish motive and who are the primary players in the narrative. And so I've put at the bottom of your screen a ton of references, about 40 or more, involving the chief priests. They seem to be involved at every level of this final drama in the earthly life of Jesus. They're involved in finding false witnesses and trying to get Judas to betray Him and paying him the money and arresting Jesus and bringing Him before not the Roman authorities, but the high priests, the top dogs of the chief priests, people like Annas and Caiaphas. When you get to the words high priest, you find almost the same number of people, and there it is at the bottom for you to do your own study. They are everywhere. Their fingerprints are all over this final narrative in the life of Jesus. Then when you get to specific individuals like Annas and Caiaphas, people who are named as being involved and movers and shakers in this narrative, you get about a half a dozen references to the previous high priest Annas and to the current high priest Caiaphas, about a dozen of those regarding Caiaphas. Then you get to a group of people called the Sadducees. This is a movement that is parallel to, somewhat similar to a movement called the Pharisaic movement. And these Sadducees they had their handprints all over it as well. They're very much involved in this because they are the booster club, not of the Pharisees, but of the high priestly families. And you find these guys, as well as the high priest, persecuting the early Christians after the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. All these guys are the main collaborators with the Romans, interestingly enough. Not the Pharisees. These guys have regular access to top Roman leadership on a regular basis, and all of them are beholden to the Romans for their positions. Now, when you get to the Pharisees regarding this last narrative, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the Pharisees are almost completely absent. You get about a half a dozen scattered references, a couple in Matthew, a couple in John, about a half a dozen of these, but they're always in collusion with the chief priests, the high priest, the priestly families. So keep in mind that many Pharisees, we learned in these episodes before this one, most Pharisees were pro-Jesus, and others only opposed Jesus out of things like envy, the text says that, and out of concern for proper teaching, as well as proper Jewish ritual practice, religious practices. But envy and doctrine or religious teaching, religious observance, aren't really strong motives for someone to pervert justice, to commit murder, and even to commit what the Pharisees called the unpardonable sin, and that was turning a fellow Jew over to the ruling government, the Romans, for execution. This is something that could not be forgiven and for which people would go directly to hell. There was no sacrifice, no amount of money, no way that they could get beyond this unpardonable sin once it was committed. So let's take another look at the other suspects in this conspiracy that led to the death of Jesus. The Sadducees, the chief priests, the high priests, specifically Annas and Caiaphas. Did they have a stronger motive than envy and concern for right teaching and right religious practice? Well, John 2 tells us that there was a temple cleansing of Jesus that took place at the beginning of his ministry, where he upset the apple cart in the temple. Matthew chapter 21 tells us about another temple cleansing at the end of Jesus' ministry. Each time Jesus upset business in the temple, and it was costing those who controlled it, the Sadducees, the high priest, the chief priestly families. It was costing those people lots and lots of money. See, the temple in Jesus' day was the Wall Street. It was the Federal Reserve. It was the Fort Knox of Judaism. From all over the world, money flowed into the temple. So now we're talking about lots of money, lots and lots of money. And that, my friends, is definitely motive for murder. Jesus was ruining their business, their cash flow, their way of life, and their own personal kingdom. But are these guys capable of murder just to keep up their posh lifestyles and their multiple thousands of feet, mansions built on the hillside facing the temple in Jerusalem? Well, Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, tells us that the high priest Annas had been appointed to the high priesthood. He followed the school of the Sadducees, and who are indeed more heartless or brutal or savage than any of the other Jewish groups when they are engaged in judgment, working in the court. So this guy, Annas, convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, who was the brother of Jesus that was called the Christ. There's a reference to Jesus outside the Bible, and called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law, and he delivered them up to be stoned. This is the kind of activity that the high priest and high priestly families were engaged in. Here's another example from that first century Jewish historian Josephus, who was born and raised in Israel. Josephus says that there was a high priest called Ananias, and he had servants that were utterly rascals, and they would go to the threshing floors and they would take by force the tithes that were supposed to go to the common priests, the ones who did the real work of sacrifice and cleaning and that kind of thing in the temple. And it says that they didn't refrain even from beating people who refused to give that tithe that was supposed to go to the common priest, but was appropriated and given to the high priestly family. Josephus says that these high priests were guilty of these very practices and were so ruthless that no one could stop them. In fact, in the olden days, Josephus says, the fact that this material, this results of the threshing floor were not going to the common priests. There were common priests who were starving to death because the high priests were taking what rightly belonged to the common priests. That's a cause of death. And so Josephus is telling us, yeah, these guys are very much capable of the death of people that got in the way of them building their own financial kingdoms. Now, in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and we're talking about stuff that was written 130 years before the birth of Jesus, as well as the rabbis tell us that the second temple, the temple from the time of Jesus, was destroyed because the high priests bought the high priesthood with money. In the rabbis are also telling us that why was that second temple destroyed? It was because they loved money and they hated one another. Another reference among the rabbinic writings is that these leaders of the temple were loving wealth and hating each other for no reason. You know, there's a passage that the rabbis tell us that happened in the days of the book of Acts, the disciples, the lives of the disciples of Jesus, where there was a famous rabbi, the son of Gamaliel, who shows up in the book of Acts, the son of Gamaliel, whose name was Simeon, and he goes into the temple and realizes that these chief priests were gouging people for sacrifices. People were having to pay $1,500 for 2 turtle doves. That's the cheapest offering that could be offered in the temple. And because of that, he sat down and gave a ruling that changed the cost of those, the smallest, the cheapest sacrifice down to about $15, a 99% reduction overnight. He recognized that there was a problem in the temple, and it was involving the priests and money. So, with the emphasis that we find in the New Testament, all of those passages that we hear about the chief priests, the high priests, Annas, Caiaphas, and the Sadducees, with this business of motive, and especially using the writings of that first century Jewish historian Josephus, as well as the material that has been preserved from the early rabbis, what made these guys tick, we know now, was money and power. And Jesus threatened both of these at least twice, 2 temple cleansings, beginning and end of his ministry. And that's what got Jesus sideways with these power brokers of the first century in the land of Israel and involving the temple. Well, I think that we've found the real enemies of Jesus, the real killers of Jesus. And guess what? It wasn't the Pharisees. I know, just like what we studied with Paul the Pharisee, or Jesus' close relationship with so many Pharisees, and all these good Pharisees that we learned about in previous episodes in the New Testament. I know that it's hard to believe that it was not the Pharisees who were the main players in the death of Jesus, but we just caught the real perpetrators and the ones who had the solid motive, and we caught them red-handed. So again, wrangling with the evidence, it's a healthy struggle. It's a stretch, I know, but it's a healthy struggle. So let's keep following the evidence, no matter where it leads us. One thing is for sure, is that when we find the truth, it will always set us free. See you next time on Waves World. Study on, guys.